Hey guys, what's going on? And welcome back to another episode of Sports Speak. It's episode 51 today. I'm Eddie Kalegi.
And I'm Tim Moore.
A lot to get to on this episode. I've got my Mets thing behind me like I always do, and I'm excited about the win in the home opener. Not too proud of how it happened. We'll discuss the Michael Conforto elbow jab, what the rules should be in the major leagues, and analyze the first week of the season. Then we'll be talking NBA. We'll be talking about Kevin Durant's return, James Harden's injury, and more about who are really contenders outside of the Nets and the Lakers for an NBA championship. And finally, the Bristol Dirt Race was last week. We want to analyze it. I loved it. Tim did not love it. We'll discuss and debate and then preview the Martinsville action this weekend. But let's start things off in the major leagues, and we are going to start with that Mets-Marlins game. Now, I was pumped. They were down 2-1. I was getting nervous they were going to fall to 1-3, and then Jeff McNeil hits a huge home run in the ninth inning. They get some base runners on. Anthony Bass was all over the place. And then Michael Conforto comes up. Now, for context, Michael Conforto had been playing brutally through the first three games. He left 11 runners on base in that last game against Philadelphia prior to this. And this is Conforto, a sure hitter who, has been inconsistent at times, but has been a staple in the Mets lineup for the last 6 years. He had his best career season in terms of batting average last year. And then 1 ball, 2 strikes. The pitch comes in for Anthony Bass. It's in the strike zone. Michael Conforto has a big elbow guard on, kind of leans into the pitch. It hits him, bases loaded. And at first, the home plate umpire signals strike 3. Then he changes it, slaps on his hand, and says, go to first base, game over. Don Mattingly was livid. Miguel Rojas was livid. The Mets were excited. And I'm not going to be biased here as a Mets fan because I love the win. I don't like the way that it came because this sets a bad precedent now that you can just lean into a pitch. And I remember this debate happened a few years ago. I believe Max Scherzer was approaching. He ended up throwing a no-hitter, but he had a chance at a perfect game, and it was against the Pirates. And it was either Starling Marte or Gregory Polanco sort of leaned into a pitch and got hit, and that's what broke up the perfect game. He still got the no-hitter, but what could have been with the rarity that comes with that. And now I worry this early in the season, this could have some big repercussions. First of all, the Marlins, the Mets have to play Miami 18 more times this season, including tomorrow. And this is a Marlins team that likes to seek retribution. Let us not forget 3 years ago when Ronald Acuna Jr. simply was hitting leadoff home runs every time they faced each other. So Jose Urania went and plunked him with the first pitch of the game after doing that 2 days in a row. And that was not really justified. If they want revenge on Michael Conforto, I mean, in some ways, it's definitely more justified than what happened with Ronald Acuna Jr. because the Marlins have been struggling, and this is a very cheap way for them to lose a game. And then, of course, the repercussions on the baseball side. This early in the season, this sets a bad precedent. We know there's been so many debates about how well the umpiring has gone. And it's not just Angel Hernandez, it's in general, and it's sometimes it strays beyond the umpires. It's also the rules themselves, what you can review, what you can't review. Instant replay is a great thing in baseball, but in a lot of cases, you can't review the most important calls. And then, of course, at the same time, we've had so many debates. I know you'll sound off on this as a Yankee fan, Tim, when we discuss the extra inning rule, which has already cost the Yankees 2 games this season. And now, just a week in, you wonder how many other times now we're going to start to see players who are in a similar situation as Michael Conforto have that split-second reaction and try to lean into a pitch. So, great win for the Mets, but really not happy with how it came and the ramifications of it.
Yeah, to me, coming from a background that does have a little bit of experience in umpiring, obviously not at a major league level, but to me, just seeing that instance with Michael Conforto was clear as day that he leaned into that pitch. And listen, too, as well, having experience pitching, you could tell immediately when someone leans. Everyone in that field's reaction, including some Mets players, was, Conforto leaned right there. And really, as an umpire, you're taught to go by your first judgment. not your second judgment, unless, of course, you have a meeting and confer about it via the debate. Now, the problem is this, that, today with umpires, in my opinion, being so sensitive with baseball, everything, is, oh, you can't say this, you can't do this anymore. It's created a problem. And if I'm being honest, this instance, Eddie, I know the ramifications are far beyond, but I could see this for Major League Baseball being very equivalent to the NFC Championship game a few years ago with the pass interference in New Orleans Saints, where you're going to see something like this down the road potentially now become reviewable because of the simple fact that, well, it's up for debate. And let's be honest, everyone viewing at home knew he leaned in. There was no shying of that. But the fact of the matter is, the umpire made initial call, then changed it. And the fact of the matter is that they got it wrong and it can't be reviewed. And this is the real problem we have for Major League Baseball. I'm not saying that everything has to be reviewed, but you brought up this point very well, Eddie. I think the fact of the matter is that Major League Baseball, with a lot of the bigger calls, the fact that you can't debate, you can't argue it, to me is a little bit concerning. But also from the umpire's perspective, there's a major problem with all these rules. MLB has so many rules. Have you ever seen an MLB umpire handbook?
No.
It is at least 250 pages. I'm not even joking. There is a good, hefty handbook that they utilize, that they go through, and I can promise you there is more rules for situations that most likely won't even happen in baseball than there are actual situations that are common every day. And to me, yes, I get the situations a little bit rare, but not really, because it comes a couple of times a season. The MLB should prepare for something like this, and I think down the road that has a change. Now going towards the Marlins, though, you mentioned in the past about them hitting Ronald Acuna for pimping home runs, as you could say, with all those leadoff home runs. I just don't know about this situation if you throw out Michael Conforto, because he took advantage of something that was ideally a rule, and it's up for debate and interpretation of baseball. But the other thing is, yes, I understand they've been robbed of a win, as have many teams, such as, and we'll talk about the extra inning rule later, but such as many teams throughout this season with that extra inning rule. And the fact of the matter is that, listen, you have to play the game that's put in front of you. Whether you like it or not, it's a 162-game season. Sure, that game can make a difference, but the fact of the matter is the Marlins have been terrible this year. In fact, if there's three teams in the league right now that I would say have been massive upsets and have been under expectations, this is one of them. Because yes, while they had a quiet offseason, they have not played the performance. Their offense has been terrible, and it just seems like they can't find any timely hitting. And it's almost like it's the pure opposite of what we saw in the pandemic baseball era just last season. Remember, this team was the hottest team in baseball after coming through the COVID scenario. And yet right now they are struggling left and right. So for me, for them to throw out Michael Conforto, it's a little bit unfortunate if that happens to be the case. But the realism is you got to play the game that's dealt in front of you. You can't blame that one game for being a reason why you may miss the playoffs in the future. It's the fact of the matter, woulda, coulda, shoulda. Your team's playing terrible right now. What about those 6-7 other games that you could have won early in the season that you didn't even show up for?
Yeah, and you mentioned it. Like this game itself, the Marlins have not been playing well. And thinking about it as well, yeah, even if Conforto had struck out, they still blew the lead. It was still bases loaded, and the Mets had a red-hot Pete Alonso coming up. Now, something shifting back to the rule book, which I also thought was interesting, is that you can no longer protest a game like they once allowed. So it's almost like, even though they've added in replay review to try to make it easier to overturn things, it seems like the MLB has instead compensated and tried to make up for that by adding some more restrictions. So it really doesn't make sense right now what they're trying to achieve. But you can't really blame this on Michael Conforto. It was a split-second decision. It wasn't a good decision, and it's a tough way to win a game, and it's not the great way to win a game. But you can't really just blame his split decision right there. At the same time, also, you can't completely blame things on the home plate umpire Ron Kolpa either. Yes, he made a bad call, and he admitted it after the game, but it really stems from the major league rules. And I feel like there are certain things that the MLB focuses on too much, such as it's hysterical every year when they make a big deal about pace of play. And this has been going on for about 7 years, and they'll be talking about having a pitch clock and only so many mound visits, and it never really makes a difference. When I've been going to Citi Field for the past few years, they always have that pitch clock going. It hits 0 and nothing is ever done. So they act like they're making changes like that, and then the changes that are actually necessary for the integrity of the game don't really seem like they're happening fully. And you cannot have these loopholes in the rule book where there are certain game-changing calls that can't be reviewed. So like you said, maybe this will be a turning point for officiating, like we saw in the NFL with the Nikhil Roby-Coleman incident between the Rams and the Saints in the NFC Championship a couple years ago. But speaking of rules that have been upsetting some people, Tim, we all know you're a Yankee fan, and the Yankees, yeah, they've played decent. Of course, they've already had injuries. Aaron Judge is already hurt. Voit, we've mentioned. Garrett Cole's pitched really well, but 2 bad losses as a result of that extra inning rule with the runner on second. And while in some ways, yes, it's exciting, it adds more action to the end of the game, there's a lot of variables that are suddenly added in when you have that extra inning rule with the man on second, depending on who's running and such. Can they get home? Or if it was a guy who's, not much of a runner, is he going to get thrown out if you try to get that RBI single? And it sets up a lot of exciting plays at third and plays at the plate, but it really just kills some of the tradition of baseball. And I know they're trying to modernize the game, but I don't really like it. I don't really like that change. I thought it was something interesting to experiment with in the pandemic season. I was surprised that stayed while the DH didn't in 2021. But give me your impressions on that so far.
Yeah, I kind of have a problem with it being an 162 game season. I understand the fact that you're trying to speed up the game. And listen, I'm not going to give the Yankees any excuses by any means having 2 extra inning losses, because the fact of the matter is that A, they blew 2 leads in those scenarios. And yes, while they did go play extra innings, the fact of the matter is that each team had the same equal opportunities to win games. Granted, the fact that both teams start with runners on second. But the problem is this, and I'm going to start with a theoretical example, that the idea that a pitcher can throw a perfect game for 9 innings and lose it because their team goes to extras, as a person that's played baseball, bothers me. Because how can you say that a person can lose a game 1-0 and that run being unearned because they started with a runner on second, let's say allowed 2 fly balls to advance a runner? How can you call that a perfect game? How can you say, even if they don't allow a run, right, and the runner's still on second, how can you call that a perfect game? To me, that's a little bit bothersome. And yes, I understand that, maybe I'm an old mind and that I'm not thinking with the future of baseball. And I understand baseball is long, but this isn't how you fix the sport. Just like, for example, let's think about a few years ago, most recently, obviously now, when baseball was in the 1900s, we went through the dead ball era. Now we're in the era where we hit so many home runs. We're in an era now where home runs have actually become boring. So what did baseball do this year, Eddie? They reduced the capabilities to hit home runs, and what they do? Make changes to the baseball so that there isn't as much pop off the bat, so that there isn't as many home runs. Well, I see this being the same way. So now you're turning around and telling me high-scoring games are something that's entertaining? Because it's not. At the end of the day, well, if you've watched baseball your entire life, even if you're a new fan, aren't you going to be more enticed to see a close game? Yes, I understand there's not a lot of scoring, but a close game that's 1-0, maybe 2-1, and has every single at-bat matter, compared to a game that, sure, is played one way, then you go to extra innings, and it's like, oh, that person has a runner start on second, and each inning, these guys translate, scoring 1 run at a time. And next thing you know, it's kind of like college football, where the final score is like, I don't know, 13-12. to me, it's bothersome. It really is. It's not the fact of the matter, for example, like I mentioned with the Yankees. Listen, you have your even opportunities, but it should not be how this game is played. No team should allow one hit and that not being a home run, for example, in an extra inning game and lose a game as a result. You should lose a game how the game started. And it's the fact of the matter of this. This is my last point, Eddie. You can't tell me, just for example, like with the NASCAR race, you can't tell me drivers are going to be allowed to drive one way for 199 laps in the Daytona 500. And then lap 200, we're going to take the yellow line rule away and have cars do whatever they want when they want. Should be the same way with baseball. You play 9 innings of baseball one way. Why change it for the rest if you have to go to extras? Do you see basketball changing the rules? Do you see them doing 2-on-2s, 3-on-3s on the basketball court to try to make as much space, make the games as fast as possible? No, they keep it 5-on-5. Sure, it's not a full 15 or 12-minute quarters. And for example, football now they do the full 15 minutes, 11-on-11. Sure, those rules are still controversial, but you look at in sports, the game is still the same. No team starts with an advantage. So the fact of the matter is, baseball's got to go back to its roots. What made the game good? And listen, home runs, sure, they're exciting, but offense doesn't make baseball. What baseball needs to do to get people to watch the game, and I understand the pace play is a concern, you need to make the game exciting with meaning. Every inning needs to have meaning. In my opinion, the problem isn't the length of games. It's rather how long games are. 162 games in a year is a lot. I'm not saying that, that those games aren't meaningful. But listen, I could turn on baseball tomorrow and the game is not really meaningful because, listen, the Yankees will be on the next day. You want to entice this generation that wants to see something exciting. They want to see it in the moment. You've got to enact. And I'm not saying that, last year was perfect, but it was a perfect example of what baseball fans wanted to see. A short season that had meaning. Every game mattered. I'm not saying every year has to be a 60-game season. But that's a perfect example of what baseball needs to find a balance with. And the fact of the matter is, a rule like this isn't doing that.
Yeah, I completely agree. I will refute one claim because hockey has, they've adapted to the 3-on-3 in the NHL in overtime. And of course, they have the shootout. So they do change the rules a little bit. And I'm not saying that I have to be so stoic with baseball. It's America's pastime. It can never change. But yes, I understand the game should progress with time, but I don't really agree with implementing an extra inning rule. I think there's other things you can do. And like you said, I think a lot of the players would even agree to say, in some ways, the season can be a bit too long. I think the teams do deserve a few more off days. I think the intrigue would come if there were less games on TV. I think it wouldn't be as much of a diluted market. I feel like so many times, especially with spring training being a month long, you can go and with the playoffs another month, 8 out of the 12 months of the year, every single day baseball is on. And for the very passionate baseball fans like myself and you, that's fine. But for the casual watcher, it doesn't really help them lock in for a full season if they have to commit to following a team every day for 162 games from April to September. I think there are some changes with that. Now, pace of play, I think there are some things you could take a look at. If you want to do a pitch clock, okay, enforce it. How about put it on a screen? How come in 8 years of having a pitch clock, it's never been shown on the screen to the viewer at home? It's buried in the back corner somewhere in the outfield. I think those are things that you can do if you want to make changes and try to get people to watch the game. And last point is this, and then we'll transition. But like you said, with home runs, yeah, I like watching home runs. I think they're interesting, but there's other aspects of the game. There's pitching, there's strategy. Think about how golf, for example, baseball has seen their ratings go down recently. Golf has not seen that. In fact, during the pandemic, yes, it was aided by the fact that there weren't many sports on, but golf's ratings have gone up. And everybody complains about how boring golf is, but they stick to tradition and they still have passionate viewers. I feel like baseball sometimes strays away because they feel like they have to try to follow in the footsteps of the NFL or the NBA to keep up with them. And they don't have to do that. I know they're considered our national pastime, but they do not have to necessarily keep up with the NFL and the NBA. You have to keep the traditional fans happy, but at the same time, try to bring in younger audiences. And at this point right now, I don't think they're really making much of an effort to do either of those things with the current rules in place. But regardless, the season has started. Don't want to be too much of a Debbie Downer because we've seen some great games so far this season. I'm going to have us each go through one team that is surprising in a good way so far and one team who has kind of been disappointing. I'm going to say a positive surprise, the Philadelphia Phillies, because we've been talking about how the Mets and Braves would be the two favorites in the NL East without question. Well, the Phillies just went through and won 5 out of 6 games against those two teams to start the season. It was at Citizens Bank Park in front of fans, and it's pretty clear there's been a lot of home field advantage for this first week having fans. But that being said, all of the holes that the Phillies had coming into the season seem to have been relieved, especially the bullpen. Their bullpen has been lights out against some really strong offenses in Atlanta and New York. The rotation has been solid. Of course, Aaron Nola leading the way. And then that offense, Bryce Harper, JT Realmuto, both red hot right now. Alec Boehm, who came onto the scene last year as a rookie third baseman, getting the everyday playing time, is doing a great job. How about Didi Gregorius as well at shortstop? And it's important to mention, the Phillies did not think they were going to be able to re-sign Gregorius or Realmuto. There were thoughts of maybe Didi Gregorius returning to the Yankees or somewhere else. And then, of course, JT Realmuto, everybody thought that he was going to the Mets. Well, they brought them both in. They're clearly happy to be there, and the Phillies are doing a great job so far. Now, the question is, can they keep this up when they go on the road, and will that bullpen sustain throughout the season? But nonetheless, it's a really nice start. And my disappointing team, I know we've already mentioned the Marlins. I'm going to go with Oakland. I know we've mentioned and we've both agreed before that the A's always get off to slow starts, and they did have to play Houston to start the season, and they did get that win against the Dodgers in the walk-off with Mitch Moreland. But that being said, I have not been impressed with their offense. They have been very quiet, and this is a team that has prided themselves on their cheap offense, a low-salary team that they still find talent. Matt Chapman, Matt Olson haven't been playing as well as you might have expected. Chad Pinder has looked pretty good, but it's clear that Houston is really talented this year. Garbage cans aside, they're playing really well right now, and Oakland's going to have to try to keep up with them. And don't count out the Angels either. I know Shohei Ohtani was lights out on Sunday Night Baseball with the bat and on the mound, so don't want to count them out. And, of course, Seattle has a lot of prospects. But Oakland, they've been able to just sort of coast these last couple of years to get into the postseason, and they've really only had to compete with Houston. But I think it's starting to shift a little bit in that AL West right now, and that's going to continue to change as we go forwards, and these prospects come up for Seattle and the Angels try to make some changes and try to better that pitching staff, and Texas starts to move into their next generation of players. But right now, I think Oakland clearly has to improve. They've got some issues with the pitching staff right now that I think they have to try to iron out because they did not look good at all in that opening series against the Astros. So, Tim, one positive surprise, one disappointment so far this season.
Yeah, you actually just briefly mentioned the team that I was going to say that's probably been the biggest surprise, and that's been the Angels. I mean, when you think about it, Joe Madden, I guess, really just cannot handle losing, Eddie. It took him one terrible season, and all of a sudden, the Angels find themselves in a pretty solid situation. Now, sure, if I'm not mistaken, this is Albert Pujols' final year, correct?
Yes.
So the way I look at it is that, sure, you could be playing around and trying to push your Albert, but I'll tell you what, this team is really starting to put it together. They're really starting to play good baseball. And the biggest critique, I guess you could say, for the Angels that have been is the fact that over the past few years, it's not because the baseball team has been terrible. It's been more the fact that they've been inconsistent, and when they shine, their opposing end struggles. And what I mean by that is at times when their pitching has been great, their offense has been awful. But when their offense really, really shines, it's like then the bullpen tends to lack. This year, they seem to have found a little bit of balance. And again, I know it's an early taste, but I'm very bought in right now by this Angels team, and I really expected nothing compared to the Athletics, which I'm not, for the record, you already mentioned them. They've been my biggest disappointment by far. I really didn't expect the Angels to be there. But again, every year in baseball, we have a team that kind of surpasses expectations. I think just like the Marlins last year, the Angels is this team that played under the radar and is going to continue to get better. And I'm excited to see if they can battle with Houston. I mean, Houston's really strong right now. I'm really excited to see what the Astros do moving forward, especially when they get Justin Verlander back. But that team with Zach Greinke led is really, really strong, and their pitching is actually better than ever. My biggest disappointment, you mentioned the Athletics. I'm not going to go with them. I'm going to go with the Atlanta Braves. I think the Braves have been an utter disappointment. This is a team that, especially in all sports news rankings, was ranked fourth going into baseball going into this year. Now, think about that for a second. This team was ranked top 5, and they currently sit, I believe it's third to last, only because Miami's terrible. And also, obviously, Washington's played one. I think it's only 3 games to this point. So the fact of the matter is that, this team, not saying that they need to come off in a hot start, but this team was expected to dominate. They were expected to be an offensive juggernaut, but yet they haven't been that. And listen, we knew their pitching wasn't really that good, but their pitching has actually been underwhelming as well. If you want to win baseball games, you've got to be consistently competitive. And that's been always my criticism about the New York Yankees, is that you're not consistent when you need to be. Those who are consistent at what they do go on to do successful things, such as the 2016 Red Sox and so on as an example. The fact of the matter is Atlanta, it's a little bit concerning. There is not all the stuff put together. And I think the fact of the matter is, yes, this team will turn around, but you can already tell early on that this team's going to need to make a couple acquisitions to make themselves that World Series contender that they once were. I mean, when you think so deep into a season that you want to win, you want to see a team be successful, and you look back early in the year and see what your team started with. Listen, I know things shape out in a 162-game season, but usually teams that struggle like this tend to not play well, and that's why I'm a little bit concerned come October time for the Braves. Not saying that they're not going to recover from this. I think the NL East is competitive enough that there's a chance they can still compete for a division, but right now we're looking at maybe a wild card team at best if the Braves continue to be in the direction they're going. And I do want to mention one other disappointment. I was watching the Arizona Diamondbacks the other day, and by no stretch of the imagination should this team have any expectations going into the year. But how bad of a baseball team do you have to be to almost, I think when they were playing the Rockies yesterday, right? Mm-hmm. To almost get no hit by John Gray in Colorado for 6+ innings, but also not have a single, and I mean a single hitter batting above the 220 mark this early in the season. How bad of an offense do you have to be? I mean, theoretically speaking, I went through almost every roster. At least each team has 2 players above the 250 mark. The Arizona Diamondbacks have not played good offense. Not a single player is yet above that 250. They're creeping towards the Mendoza line, which really makes me want to think. Obviously, I know a few years ago they traded away Paul Goldschmidt. But the fact of the matter is, what is the future for the Diamondbacks? I mean, it's like every player they've gotten, they've traded away for nothing. Every opportunity they've had to be successful, it's been terrible. And honestly, and I know this sounds crazy, but what's the difference from putting every single player they have there on the field compared to, I don't know, a guy like Jake Lamb? They used to be one of their heroes in Arizona. Remember that? Because his biggest criticism was he's like Joey Gallo. He strikes out too much. Sure, he has pop, but he can't keep the ball in play. What makes him different from any of these other players? I mean, it is upsetting what I'm seeing in Arizona, and I feel bad for Madison Bumgarner, who put himself in a situation like that, because I'll tell you what, you complain about the Mets, for example, not giving Jacob deGrom run support. I think if Madison Bumgarner's lucky, if he sees 5 runs put on offense the entire season while he's pitching on the mound.
Well, the one thing too, Madison Bumgarner has looked awful in his first two starts, albeit one of them was against the Padres, but still, he's been getting knocked around. Chad Kelly's been getting knocked around on the mound for them. Guys you're expected to see find success. Of course, Zach Gallen, who had that breakout year last year, is also injured, so they're without a lot of help, but yeah, the Dodgers and Padres are good, but you've got to capitalize in games against San Francisco and Colorado if you want any chance of being a contender out of that West Division. And a lot to really change there in Arizona. But let's shift gears to the NBA. I've got two topics to get to. First one, I'm going to talk about the Brooklyn Nets here because, well, we can really just meld it into one thing because the Nets, yes, they keep playing well. And now Durant gets inserted, and they're playing just fine. And, of course, Blake Griffin, LaMarcus Aldridge, they're making all the necessary contributions. But I worry heading into the postseason because now, the moment Durant comes back, now James Harden has a strained hamstring. That's going to keep him out at least a week and a half. And if he comes back during that time frame, if he comes back in the 10 days that he's supposed to after he gets reevaluated, they're only going to have 16 games left. And you imagine there's going to be a couple of rest days thrown in there, a couple of times that the players are out. So you're going to get maybe a max of 10 games with the big three in there. I don't know if that's enough time to meld for the postseason. Yes, you've got three great players, two of them historically excellent postseason players in Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving. But I don't know how well they're going to fit together heading into the postseason because we've seen this Nets team be disappointing against some of the worst teams. In all honesty, I think if they get to the championship, they can win it. But they've got to get through some teams first. And you can't shy away against some of these Eastern Conference teams. The Knicks, yeah, they keep beating the Knicks, but the Knicks are giving them all kinds of fits and keeping it close every time. Julius Randle almost won on a buzzer beater in their last matchup. I believe that was on Monday, and that was in Brooklyn as well. So them, you can't count out the Indiana Pacers if you face off with them. Then, of course, Philadelphia and Milwaukee are also juggernauts in the Eastern Conference. So that being said, with the Nets having these issues with cohesion and not having much time to get their three stars working together, and then, of course, the Lakers being completely without LeBron and Anthony Davis right now, they're still playing pretty well, but they're falling back and could end up losing a home court advantage in the first round. They're at the 4 spot right now. They've got Phoenix and the Clippers right around them, so it's pretty easy for them to slip back and not having home court advantage. And maybe they'd love to have it against the Clippers where it would still be home court advantage. But if they fall back to the 5 seed and they're facing off with, for example, the Phoenix Suns, who have Chris Paul, Devin Booker, and a lot of hungry Phoenix players, they can give them fits. So while we favor the Nets and Lakers, and when they're fully healthy, I think it's undeniable. I think we can both agree these are the two most talented teams in the NBA. But I don't know what to really make of it with all these injuries they have right now and how healthy these guys will be when the playoffs start. We're just 4 weeks away from the postseason beginning, so they've got to figure things out. But my question to you is this. Who do you think could possibly jump in if the Nets and Lakers are riddled with injuries and a lack of consistency heading into the playoffs?
Well, by jump in, do you mean in terms of free agency?
Nah. In the championship.
Oh, you're just talking about team. Okay, I was gonna say if you're talking about players, I was gonna say, listen, at this point, I feel like the Nets can get almost anyone at this point. I mean, this team is literally going for a championship or bust. But, if I'm looking at the championship picture, I'd have to agree in regards to, it could be a little bit concerning of a matchup for, this Brooklyn team. But, to be honest, I feel like, maybe on the Eastern side, it could be Milwaukee, maybe Philadelphia. Again, it's really a borderline, Eddie, if I'm being honest, because the big thing is the fact of the matter. The one big picture that we talked about 2 months ago and all the way back to the start of this season for this Nets team is, listen, it doesn't matter who you put on the floor for this team. They just cannot find a way to play good basketball against bad basketball teams. And the fact of the matter is this. I'm very worried still for the Nets if they earn the 1 seed to be playing an 8 seed in the Eastern Conference. Because I have a feeling, just like, for example, remember the Atlanta Hawks all those years back, going 7 long games? I would not be surprised, and whoever wins the play-in, that they end up going a very long way against them. So the fact of the matter is this, listen, I think Brooklyn is going to go to the NBA championship. I think this team has a lot of potential. Listen, if you have 5 past superstars in the league all on your starting lineup, there should be no reason. I mean, listen, I understand Blake Griffin, was in his prime, years back through his injuries, but Blake Griffin's still a very productive basketball player. You look at Aldridge, he was put right in the fire right away. We know what he can be. We know what James Harden is. We know what Kyrie Irving is. And of course, we know what Kevin Durant is. I'm not too worried about these injuries right now because when all these 5 are on the floor together to start a game come playoff time, they're going to be dominant. That team's going to be really good. But the fact of the matter is what does the Nets' depth have for it to win them a championship? Now, on the Western side, I still don't know what to think. Obviously, yes, no Anthony Davis, no LeBron James. The team is faltering. Denver might have had still my favorite, if I'm not mistaken, to play the NBA championship and beat Brooklyn. But ultimately, I still think this team has what it takes once it gets healthy. But the fact of the matter is it really all comes down to who really wins the battle for the 1 seed. Phoenix continues to play good basketball. Obviously, we saw them play a close affair last, maybe 2 days ago? Now, it wasn't last night. So, 2 days ago against the Utah Jazz, in which now that's going to be a very exciting series to see if it's to come in the NBA playoffs. The Jazz are obviously still playing well. I think the fact of the matter is, though, for LA, if it's not them, you'd have to imagine, obviously, the Clippers could jump into a picture. But I still think it right now has to be either the Jazz or the Suns. I really think these 2 teams have stood out. They've played good basketball. And listen, the Suns have been under the radar for so long because of how many underwhelming seasons they've had year in and year out, with Devin Booker being the only person there. But ever since they made those moves to make their basketball team so much better, this Phoenix Suns team is an absolute threat. I'm not saying they're going to win an NBA championship, but you cannot count them out of a Western Conference Finals win when it's all said and done. How do I put it like this? Their best comparison, and I don't, 2 different teams, 2 different players, but how they're playing their system to perfection, I consider almost kind of like the Miami Heat situation, just with better basketball players. You have a system that's right for everyone. You're finding success. Come playoff time, if that continues to be the way, this team's going to go a very long way. But needless to say, I think those are the teams that you're going to have to look for if it's not the Nets and the Lakers. But I'm not too worried about Brooklyn. I think you're going to be just fine.
Yeah, I just get worried about the point guard position, about Kyrie Irving and James Harden sharing the ball. Yeah, they've played pretty well together, but when Durant also wants to get touches, and LaMarcus Aldridge and Blake Griffin, along with Joe Harris, all of those guys are proving they need to get the ball. They need to get shots because they can make them. And you wonder about the morale on this team because we know that there's a lot of personality on this Brooklyn Nets team, to put it lightly. And we know Kyrie Irving can really be brought down mentally, and then that really hurts his game physically if he's not getting the touches he wants. Similarly, we know Kevin Durant, he still sees himself as the face of this franchise, but then James Harden has come in and has played an MVP level performance in games without both Irving and Durant and has really keyed this team to victory. So a lot of things. Now, one thing you did mention were your concerns with the Brooklyn depth. I do think that this team has the depth necessary. Nicholas Claxton, for example, has really come onto the scene. He played well in the bubble last year and now has filled the void of Jarrett Allen after he got traded in the Harden deal and is playing some great center. Jeff Green, another veteran, has played a lot of postseason games with Oklahoma City and Boston in his career, and he's done well fitting in. He's a small ball center, can also shoot the 3-ball. Bruce Brown as well, a shooting guard. He's a great rebounder. He's willing to mix it up down low and play defense, which is good because the Nets have a lot of players who don't like to play defense. But I think the depth could be good. I just worry about the cohesion with the 3 stars. But let's move on to maybe the thing I was most excited about. We're going to have a little debate here about the Bristol Dirt Race 2 weeks ago, won by Joey Logano, 7th different winner in 7 races so far in the Cup Series. But mixed feelings about this race. obviously are out there. Of course, the circumstances were difficult. Again, Mother Nature wreaks havoc on what could have been a big day for NASCAR. The truck and cup races both moved to Monday. The truck race, they had one lap of one heat race, and then the trucks got covered in mud and they couldn't race anymore. It was a mess. But the races themselves, I thought they were pretty compelling. And I know Tim's going to make the argument that it didn't look too good. There were some bad crashes, but I got to refute that, because thinking about when NASCAR first went back to the dirt with the truck races at Eldora, there was a lot of chaos in those races too. Maybe not to the extent of what we saw last Sunday, but still, there were a lot of wrecks, a lot of bad driving from drivers. There were plenty in the field who had no dirt racing experience. And that's a similar deal here with the Cup Series. It's not like, actually, I think it was worse than the trucks, because at least in the Truck Series, there were a lot of one-off starts for drivers who were able to jump in and get to race a little bit, and who had a lot of dirt racing experience and just wanted to get in some action in the trucks. Because of the charter system in the Cup Series, the only way you could really get in the field as a dirt racing specialist was driving for Rick Ware Racing. And that's what we saw with Chris Windom. And then, of course, Stuart Friesen driving the 77. But you didn't really have that. So you had a lot of drivers who had no experience. The only experience they had was the iRacing series, which doesn't really prepare you for a track that you've never actually driven on before. So they didn't really know what to expect. And NASCAR already announced that the race is coming back next year, and I'm looking at it like this. Maybe it wasn't the best race. I still found it very enjoyable. It's one race out of 36. I think it's good that NASCAR is embracing their roots as a quote-unquote grassroots sport to go back and race dirt for the first time in 50 years, whereas other sports, it seems like baseball, football, and basketball, will tend to try to make you forget about their history dating back more than 20 years. NASCAR is trying to embrace their history, and they've been doing it very well these last few years, of course, with the Darlington throwback races. And it's quite the dichotomy from these other sports that act like they didn't exist before 2000. But regardless, I feel like NASCAR, they're going to have a new car next year. They have some things to iron out. Of course, for example, those dirtles that caused that first accident. I think those things are idiotic. You don't need them on the track. But I feel like as they get more experience, drivers now will have the experience of racing on the dirt at Bristol. They can get better with packing the dirt as well, so it doesn't get completely blacked out into nearly a asphalt surface with just a dusty covering by the end of this race. And with the next gen car, they've got time to experiment and figure out the best way to run on dirt. So I think this year was kind of a makeshift thing, testing out what could go right, what could go wrong. I'd kind of compare it in some ways to baseball, having some rules changes for the pandemic season. But I think the Bristol Dirt Race, of course, it's here to stay for next year. I think we should keep a dirt race in the Cup schedule going forwards. It embraces past history, and it creates some really exciting racing.
Yeah, I have to agree in regards to the fact that they should keep dirt race in the Cup schedule. My fact of the matter is, I just don't think it should be Bristol. I mean, I'll tell you what, yeah, the Dirtles were absolutely embarrassing. Just the fact of the matter of, just for example, like at the road courses where you add the turtles and it causes damage, you knew it was going to create havoc. Now, we'll start with the truck race. I had a massive problem with the truck race. The fact of the matter is this: 150 lap race, which is relatively fair for a dirt race. But yes, I understand the lack of experience in the field. But when you look at the fact that the reason why dirt racing is so great, especially in other cars, is the fact that, yes, there are wrecks from time to time. There's side by side racing, and there's a capability of multi-groove, or how do I put it, to race multi-grooves on a track. You didn't really have that chance after about the first 30 laps of Bristol. It was one lane. You had to move the car out of the way in front of you, and that's it. I understand that every track is like Eldora, but the fact of the matter is that they couldn't even go 10 laps without having a wreck because with the problems with the grooves, but then on top of it, yes, the lack of experience had to play, but there was visibility issues. The red clay mud ad, which I will go on a tangent about too, caused massive problems. There's a lot of drivers that hated the fact that they couldn't see out of their windshields more than maybe 2 feet in front of them because NASCAR thought it was a great idea to utilize red clay on Bristol's surface. And listen, I understand dirt racing's its own component. There's dirt drivers that will tell you, yes, the racing was awesome. And I agree to an extent. It was awesome. It was fun to have dirt racing, but it wasn't fun to watch 90 caution laps around the truck race. It's to me, when you're counting caution laps, they don't do that in dirt racing. So when I'm watching almost nearly 50% of a race under yellow, that's not entertaining to me. That doesn't do any justice. The other problems too I have is this, and think about this with an open mind for a second. How can a car at 200 miles an hour at a restrictor plate track get a couple dents and bruises? They can go repair the car in the pits and come back out and continue on driving the car 170 miles an hour. But then, barely at speeds of 120 miles an hour, you see sheet metal completely ripped off the car. The cars are almost nearly undrivable and almost look like they went through a grinder. Yet at restrictor plate tracks, it looks totally opposite. There's more damage done in a dirt race at lower speeds than there are at restrictor plate tracks. It's bad enough that, first off, it's embarrassing that the pace car finished ahead of a couple of cars in the field. You have all these wrecks going on. Sure, the side-by-side racing is great. It's some of the best stuff you've ever seen. But no wonder why they're always side-by-side, because there's about 12, 13 cautions in a race, and you're spending about 5, 6 of them under yellow doing, 65, 70 laps under caution. Then let's go to the Cup race. The clay was completely done. For the first time, I think it's maybe back since 2008, when NASCAR instituted the double file rule. You have to go back to single file. Why? Because the track failed you. You couldn't hold 2 lanes. You had to go single file. And sure, finally, stage 3, we got our one incredible green flag run. But guess what? No one could pass. Lap traffic caused problems. We saw a bunch of yellows. And oh, by the way, the worst part about it, forget about the damage stuff that I mentioned in the truck race. How about the fact that you couldn't even bump and run a car if you wanted to in the Cup race? Because if you slightly made contact with a person's left rear tire, you were cutting their tire down. Think about how many tire problems we had in that race. So it's not bumping and banging. It wasn't side-by-side racing. It was a wreck fest to end up becoming a single file train around Bristol. It's not the tack of dirt racing. To me, it's the fact of what is so enjoyable other than the nostalgia feel of Cup coming back to dirt when you couldn't actually have a product of what a race is supposed to bring at this racetrack. All we heard was, oh, it's going to make racing incredible. We may see a multi-groove race at Bristol again. People could drive the bottom and the high side. Yet the cars that physically tried to drive the high side, Kyle Larson, Christopher Bell, some of the most experienced guys, might I add, ended up crashing in both races, Larson particularly in both races, because, oh, might I add, a car had back in the truck race, a tire failure, and what ended up happening, Kyle Larson clobbered him because NASCAR couldn't throw a yellow immediately and let it happen for 2 laps, and that driver couldn't get down in the pits. I understand there's learning. I understand there's going to be failures. But how can you say this is a good race when NASCAR had to change its rules on the fly, when they had to do so many things? How can you say racing is good when you have 13 yellows, laps count, half the race is done under caution? That, to me, is what was bothersome. I'm not taking a shot at Bristol, for the record. I'm glad that there is a dirt race on the schedule. Dirt racing is incredible. It's its own phenomenon. I'm not saying it doesn't belong in NASCAR, but you cannot say that race was good on Monday 2 weeks ago when the fact of the matter is all there was wrecks and forced side-by-side racing because of the cautions it provided.
Okay. Here we go. Okay. So first off, I do agree with some of the things. So camera's going all over the place. I do agree with some of your points about, first of all, having to change the rules to a single file restart is ridiculous. But a lot of that was also because of the track conditions. And a lot of the issues that you brought up were in terms of mechanics and in terms of the track. And these are things that NASCAR couldn't really expect. Bristol had had dirt on it for 1 week in the last 10 years. They weren't really used to this. They tried to base some of it off of what they saw last week, the week prior, when they had a bunch of late model races there. But of course, just logically, the NASCARs are a lot heavier, and that can cause a lot of other issues that they didn't really see. But NASCAR didn't really develop the tire, I feel like. That's kind of why there were all the tire failures. And also, I think they were not really focused on building these cars as strong as they typically do. That one crash with Eric Almirola, the fact that 4 cars got destroyed in that, yes, Eric Almirola took a couple of hard hits, but the fact that 4 cars couldn't continue from that is ridiculous. All of that said, I'm not saying that that's a bad race, and I'm not saying that dirt racing at Bristol is necessarily bad. Yes, I might rather have a pavement race at Bristol, but when you think about this from a marketing aspect for NASCAR, there are not many dirt tracks out there that could really host the crowd that NASCAR would expect for a cup race. One of the only venues is Eldora, but with the recent, sort of bad relationship that they've had with Tony Stewart over the last year with the Superstar Racing Experience starting, that kind of didn't become an option. And we've seen that now that Eldora has gone from the truck schedule and has been replaced with Knoxville, which might be the only other dirt venue that could possibly support a cup race down the line. I'd love to see that there, and maybe I'd like to see a second pavement race at Bristol. But I think you can still make this work. And these issues here, think about what NASCAR's focus is right now here in 2021. They want to prepare this next-gen car for 2022 because they're already a year behind on that, and they can't risk falling any further behind because a lot of NASCAR fans are really hoping that this can be a turning point for the Cup Series. And they are really impressed by watching the tests, hearing how the engine sounds, that this could be a drastic improvement from the Generation 6, especially these last couple of years with the spoilers and the splitters and the low horsepower and high downforce packages that have made fans and drivers alike angry. So NASCAR has been focused on that, and they did not focus as much on the dirt race and making the cars prepared for that, which is a mistake on their part. They also did not expect that Bristol would be basically underwater the day before, which completely altered the surface that they had to race on. There were a lot of things that were out of NASCAR's control. That being said, I did enjoy the racing in some ways. The single groove racing that we saw a lot was very reminiscent of what people consider old Bristol. And you think about some of those notable Bristol finishes with bumps and runs with Dale Earnhardt and Rusty Wallace and Terry Labonte in the 1990s when NASCAR was at its height in popularity. You mix that in, you get that with dirt. You've got dirt on banking, which, by the way, redefines dirt because we've seen how NASCAR has sort of failed in past occasions when they've tried to copy other types of racing. Just think about the Brickyard 400, which never gained the popularity that they hoped racing in Indianapolis because that is for IndyCar. They want to have dirt racing, but I think they need to rebrand it as their own type of dirt racing. It does not have to be exactly the same as a late model race. So Bristol might be unconventional, but I think you can make it work. And overall, they've been focused on the next-gen car. I'm not too worried. First couple Eldora races were not that good. It's a similar story here. The Bristol race here, there was a lot of wrecking. There were things you could be frustrated about, but we did get some of that old Bristol feel. You got the short track racing, and you got some good action and some good battles around the track. There are things they have to change for next time, but I think it was a solid start, and I'm not too concerned about a Bristol race being there next year and beyond.
Well, let me ask you this question. Are you okay with them doing 2 Bristol dirt races and making one in the playoffs, as that's also potentially under discussion?
No, I'm gonna stop there because I still like having the night pavement race at Bristol in the summer. I think there's tradition that's built in with that. I think it's fine to change the spring race. I wouldn't really alter that. And Yes, there was a lot of wrecking in this, and I think that's going to continue here, at least through these first few Cup dirt races, with so many Cup drivers not having a dirt background. And I'd argue that's increasing now because more and more people are like William Byron and Anthony Alfredo, who have more of a background actually in video games and with iRacing than actual racing on tracks. So not a lot of them have these dirt backgrounds, and I think that's going to continue to decrease, which could cause more chaos when they make their debuts on dirt, not knowing how to handle the car, not knowing how to manage their tires because everybody was complaining about tire wear, and also the visibility issue. All of that said, we already have enough of these wild card races per se in the postseason. And if you're going to have this format, you already have two races that completely throw everything out the window. You've got the Charlotte Roval, and then you've got Talladega. I don't know if you necessarily need a third.
Well, they would ideally, they're considering making one in each round when you think about it, which, I mean, Bristol's ready as it is early on in the playoffs. But to me, that's another thing that's bothersome. You know, the fact of the matter is, yes, if you want to add some dirt to NASCAR, listen, I'm all for it. I'm not saying that, again, dirt should not be at Bristol in the future. I think that next year is going to be a lot better. But just like Eldora took a step up after the first year, and I know you mentioned that race in particular with its accidents, but if this doesn't produce multi-groove racing next year fully, or doesn't, how do I put it, doesn't produce a racing surface capable of not puffing up a ton of dust and causing, you know, a lot of problems for drivers, rather if it's mechanically or even the fact of, you know, drivers not even being able to, you know, race a race how you would at a typical other track. That's when I start really raising concerns. And again, my problem with it had to do with the fact of the race itself and how it was handled. Yes, there was a lot of things that the track filled for, but let's also like dirt was on the schedule for a long time, and NASCAR had opportunities to test this stuff out, and they didn't. So they threw themselves into the fire and they threw themselves under the blanket. Listen, I understand they're testing the new generation car. We watched Tyler Reddick kind of crash it the other day. So listen, if you could put effort and send guys to do that at a track like that, why shouldn't you bring people to Bristol to test a dirt track? To me, that, you know, would make the most common sense for something being out of the norm. But again, I mean, I think that Bristol, you know, if you want to go with the dirt race every year, listen, that's great. But having two, I don't know. To me, it's a little bit gimmicky, and quite frankly, you know, again, I like dirt racing. In fact, I love dirt racing. But to me, it's, you look at the schedule. If you're just trying to put butts in seats, that's not what it's going to work. Other sports have tried it. Listen, NASCAR is a great push right now, but stick to what's a good product of racing. Not saying dirt's not a good product of racing, but stick to what you know that's a good product of racing and try to evolve it through that, rather than trying to force other sports in other ways. As you mentioned, for example, like the MLB trying to be the NFL or the NBA, don't try to be, you know, a dirt late model. Don't try to be, you know, wheel and modifieds and short tracks, for example. Just be what you are and what you're good at and showcase that, because that's what's going to make the racing better, just like the old generations.
Yeah, and just to conclude, that kind of fits in with my point, and I made that same argument, for example, about Indianapolis and why that was a flop. But I feel like if NASCAR can kind of rebrand their own style of dirt racing and not have to be like the late models, I think we can both agree that that could be successful for the sport. But let's move on to a short track that's actually not going to have dirt on it this weekend, and that's Martinsville Speedway. Night racing, unfortunately, rains in the forecast again for the Cup race, so let's see if they run into even more problems here. But first true night race of the season. Of course, the Daytona 500 turned into one, but are we going to see an eighth different winner in 8 races? And if so, Tim, who's your pick?
You know what? I'm going to say no. I think that this is going to be the first multi-winner on the year, and I'm going to go with Joey Logano. I think this is a long time coming. If I'm not mistaken, he's actually starting on the pole, and you could correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Joey's going to make it back-to-back weeks. The 22 team's been pretty strong, obviously putting together a couple of good finishes. But think about all the years where Logano's been kind of around the brink. but then just necessarily hasn't been able to get the job quite done. You remember that race all the way back when Matt Kenseth took him in the playoffs and ultimately ended up costing him a Final Four opportunity. That was an example, but I think Logano is a really strong car, really strong candidate. Obviously, there's going to be guys that are favorites, such as Denny Hamlin, Chase Elliott, just to name a few, Martin Truex Jr. I think those Gibbs Toyotas are going to also be very, very strong, but I think that we need to see our first multi-time winner eventually, and we're going to probably see it at the paperclip.
I'm going to agree with you. I think we're going to get a multi-time winner, but I'm going to go with Martin Truex Jr. That team clearly had figured something out with that 19 crew, not just in the Cup race, but also in the truck race. Truex was the best driver at the best Bristol dirt track, and he had never run an official points race at a dirt track in his entire racing career. And that is also a short track, and Martinsville is a short track as well. And if you think about these last 3 years, it's hilarious how the first decade of Truex's career, he could never get to victory lane at a short track. He always struggled. But now since about 2018, and especially since joining Gibbs in 2019, he's sort of taken on that leadership and that ability at a short track that his new teammates Kyle Busch and Denny Hamlin have proven to have for the past decade of their careers. And Truex has been strong, and he also won the night race there last season shortly after the restart after the pandemic. So I'm going to go with the 19 to go to victory lane at Martinsville. But that's going to wrap up today's show. Thank you to everybody who tuned in today, and we'll have a new episode next weekend. We also are going to have our NFL draft coverage coming up in a couple of weeks, so that should be fun. A lot of action, a lot of quarterbacks out there on the market, and a lot to discuss for sure as we approach the end of April with that. But until next time, I'm Eddie Kalegi.
And I'm Tim Moore.
Signing off from Sports Speak, and we hope you have a great rest of your weekend.